Look at the static on an old television screen long enough, and you will see a face. It isn't there. You know it isn't there. And yet it arrives anyway, uninvited, assembled out of nothing but noise, and for one strange second, you feel watched by something that does not exist. Sit with that. Because what just happened in your skull is not a glitch. It is the oldest function your species has. It is the thing your brain was built to do before it could do almost anything else. Take chaos, take pure meaningless static, and hand you back a face. And the question that should be keeping you up tonight is not why the face appeared. It's whether anything you've ever perceived was ever anything but that. Here's the part nobody tells you. The world you're looking at right now, this room, this screen, this sentence, none of it is being received. It is being generated. Your eyes gather a flood of photons, an ocean of raw, undifferentiated information, and somewhere behind your eyes, in the dark, wet committee room of the visual cortex, something takes that flood and renders it into a scene, complete with edges that aren't really there, colors that are inventions of 3 overlapping wavelengths, objects that persist even when half of them are hidden behind other objects. You do not see the world. You see a hallucination that happens to be tightly and usefully correlated with the world, which means the face in the static and the face of the person sitting across from you were produced by the exact same machinery, running the exact same trick at 2 different levels of accuracy. That should unsettle you a little. Hold on to that unsettled feeling. We're going to need it. Because here's the second turn, the one that comes fast on the heels of the first, before you've had time to get comfortable with the idea that perception is invention. If your brain is a meaning-generating engine running constantly, whether or not there's meaning to generate, then the distinction between real pattern and imagined pattern isn't a wall, it's a dial. Somewhere on that dial is the astronomer plotting the actual orbit of a real planet. Somewhere else on that same dial is the conspiracy theorist finding a message in the arrangement of clouds. And the uncomfortable truth, the one your brain does not want you to look at directly, because it threatens the very trust you place in your own thoughts, is that both of them are running the same subroutine. The difference isn't in the kind of thinking, it's in whether the pattern gets checked against something outside the skull. And most of what any of us believe, most of what we call understanding, has never once been checked. Let's slow down, because I want to ground this before it floats away into abstraction, the way these things do if you let them. Think about the last time you woke up from a bad dream, still convinced, for 3 or 4 seconds, that it had actually happened. Your heart was pounding. Your body had already released the chemicals of a real threat. The dream had no external referent whatsoever. It was neurons firing in patterns shaped by nothing but their own internal weather, and yet your nervous system treated it with the same seriousness it would give a car swerving toward you on the highway. That's the mechanism, stripped down to its most intimate scale. Meaning doesn't require a source. It only requires a pattern convincing enough to trigger the machinery that responds to patterns. And once you notice that, you start to notice it everywhere. And that's when things get interesting and also a little bit dangerous, because now we have to ask, what else in your daily life is a dream you haven't woken up from yet? Consider the space between 2 people talking. Consider that what's passing between you and another human being when you speak is not, technically, meaning. It's air pressure, vibrating molecules striking an eardrum, converted to electrical signal, run through decades of accumulated pattern association, and reconstructed, on the other side, into something that feels like understanding. Nothing actually crosses the gap between 2 skulls. 2 separate brains perform 2 separate acts of pattern generation, roughly synchronized by a shared history of noises we've agreed to call words, and the illusion of a single shared meaning is so convincing that we forget, almost every waking moment, that it's an illusion at all. Linguists have a phrase for the strange machinery underneath this. They call it the arbitrariness of the sign. There is nothing dog-like about the sound dog, nothing tree-like in tree. The connection between symbol and referent is a pact, not a fact. And once that pact stabilizes across a whole culture, it stops feeling like a pact. It starts feeling like the way things simply are. which is exactly the trick your visual cortex plays on you every single time you open your eyes. So here's an open thread I'm not going to close for you. If language is an arbitrary pact that feels like inevitable truth, and perception is a hallucination that feels like direct contact with reality, what other pacts have you mistaken for facts? What have you built your entire identity on top of that was never actually load-bearing, that was just a convincing enough pattern that nobody, including you, ever bothered to check it against the noise underneath? Now, before that question spirals too far out, let's come back down to the body, because that's always where these threads have to touch ground or they drift into nothing. Think about the last time you were falling asleep and heard your name spoken clearly in a room where no one had spoken. Or the last time you saw, out of the corner of your eye, a shape move that turned out to be a coat on a hook. These aren't malfunctions. Evolutionarily speaking, they're a fantastically good trade. A brain that occasionally sees a predator in a shadow that isn't a predator loses nothing but a flinch. A brain that occasionally fails to see the predator that actually is a predator loses its whole genetic lineage on the spot. So natural selection, over the unthinkable span of deep time, tuned your perceptual apparatus not for accuracy, but for a specific and asymmetrical kind of error. It made you a false positive machine. It made you, structurally, a superstition generator, because superstition was cheaper than extinction. And this is where anthropology hands us something strange to sit with. Every human culture that has ever been documented, without exception, has generated cosmologies, origin stories, spirit worlds, unseen agents behind the weather, behind illness, behind luck. For a long time, the easy explanation was that these were simply wrong theories, primitive science, guesses that got replaced once real science arrived. But that explanation has a hole in it big enough to walk through, because it assumes the drive to generate meaning is a bug looking for a fix, rather than the same machinery that also gives us mathematics, music, architecture, love. The same pattern hunger that built cathedrals to invisible gods also built the standard model of particle physics. You don't get to keep the parts of the engine you like and disown the parts you find embarrassing. It's the same engine, all the way down. Here's where it gets genuinely strange, and I want to be careful here, because this is the kind of thing that sounds like a claim when it's actually a door. Anthropologists who spend real time inside traditional societies, not observing from outside with a clipboard, but actually living inside the symbolic architecture of another culture, sometimes report a peculiar shift. They stop being able to fully unsee the patterns the culture sees, not because they've been fooled, but because meaning, once it's pattern matched with enough emotional and social reinforcement, becomes perceptually real in a way that's very hard to distinguish from the inside, from meaning that's grounded in something external. Which raises the quiet, slightly vertiginous possibility that the difference between a myth and a fact might not always be visible from where you're standing while you're living inside either one. Let that sit. Don't resolve it. We're going to leave it there and come back to something more familiar, because I promised to keep circling back to solid ground, and I meant it. Think about scrolling. Think about the specific, itchy, low-grade compulsion to keep scrolling a feed even when nothing on it is actually satisfying you. That's the same machine. Every scroll is a bet that the next unit of noise will resolve into a face, into a signal, into something that finally means something. The infinite scroll didn't invent your brain's appetite for pattern. It just built a frictionless conveyor belt for a hunger that was already there. The same hunger that made your ancestors stare into fires and see stories, stare into the night sky and see hunters, bears, twins. A whole population of mythic beings organized out of scattered points of light that have no actual relationship to one another, except the accident of sharing your field of view. The constellations are not up there, they're in here. And once you know that, you can't quite look at the sky the same way again, which is either a loss or the beginning of something. And I honestly don't know which. And I don't think you should let me tell you, because that's a question worth carrying rather than answering. Let's go somewhere a little more dangerous for a minute, language again, but deeper this time. There's a peculiar linguistic phenomenon that happens under certain altered states, under certain kinds of glossolalia, certain trance states documented across wildly unconnected cultures, where the mouth begins producing structured, rhythmic, syntactically patterned sound that carries every surface feature of language intonation, phrase boundaries, emphasis, without mapping onto any actual lexicon. Outside observers, and often the speakers themselves, report a powerful subjective sense of meaning during the event, a feeling that something true and specific was being communicated, even though no translatable content exists. What does that tell you about meaning itself? Does it tell you that meaning is a feeling your brain can generate independently of content, a kind of pure semantic sensation with nothing underneath it, the emotional taste of significance served without the meal? Or does it tell you that meaning was never fully in the words to begin with, that words are just one of several possible triggers for a state the brain can enter on its own, given the right rhythm, the right breath, the right ritual scaffolding? I'm not going to pick one of those for you. I don't think there's a way to pick, actually, without more information than any of us currently has. But notice that both possibilities are unsettling in exactly the same direction. They both suggest that the feeling of meaning and the presence of meaning are two different things that only usually travel together. Only usually. Sit with that word. Usually implies exception. And once you accept that meaning the feeling and meaning the fact can come apart, you have to ask, quietly, in the back of your mind, how you would even know, in your own life, right now, which one you're currently having. Okay, ground again. A smell can bring back a whole year of your childhood in under a second, faster than any deliberate act of memory, faster than thought. That's not metaphorical. The olfactory bulb has a nearly direct line into the hippocampus and amygdala, bypassing the longer, more filtered routes that other senses take. Which means smell is one of the few places where the machinery of meaning-making runs so fast, it beats your own awareness to the punch. You don't decide. The smell means your grandmother's kitchen. You're already there, emotionally, before the decision could have happened. So meaning isn't always downstream of thought. Sometimes it's upstream, arriving before you, waiting for you to catch up and explain it to yourself after the fact. And this is worth dwelling on because it suggests something almost embarrassing, that a great deal of what you call your reasoning is actually narration. You feel something first, for reasons buried below conscious access, and then you build a tidy little argument to explain a conclusion your nervous system already reached without asking your permission. Which means the story you tell about why you believe what you believe might be, quite often, a beautifully constructed fiction about a decision that was never really yours to make in the way you thought it was. This is the point in the thought where I'd usually expect a voice in the back of your head to say, wait, but I know why I believe things. I can trace my reasoning. And, sure, sometimes. But notice how the confidence itself, the felt sense of, I know why, is generated by the same apparatus we've just spent this whole time discovering, can't be trusted to distinguish invented pattern from discovered pattern. The confidence isn't evidence. The confidence is just another face in the static, this time wearing the mask of certainty. Let's widen out, because there's an anthropological pattern here too big to ignore. Nearly every documented human culture developed some form of divination reading the future, or the will of unseen forces, in things that have no causal connection to the future at all. Cracks in heated bone, the flight paths of birds, the fall of marked sticks or cards, entrails, tea leaves. From a narrow modern vantage point, this looks like superstition, full stop, case closed. But look at what divination actually does, mechanically, for the people practicing it. It takes an unbearably complex decision. Should we go to war? Should we plant now, or wait? Should this marriage happen? And it offloads the decision onto a source of pure noise, precisely because the noise has no stake in the outcome and no capacity to be second-guessed the way a human authority can be second-guessed. The randomness isn't a bug in the system. The randomness is the point. It's a technology for producing a decision that feels, and therefore functions, as more legitimate than one person's fallible opinion, because it looks like it came from outside the tribe of human uncertainty altogether. And now here's the turn, because I don't want you to leave that thought thinking it's a museum piece from the past. You do this, right now. Every time you take a difficult decision and privately consult a coin flip, or notice you're waiting for a sign, or feel a decision crystallize the moment you see a particular number on a clock, you are running the exact same cognitive technology your Bronze Age ancestors ran with a heated shoulder blade. You've just swapped the ritual object. The mechanism hasn't changed even slightly in 10,000 years. Which raises a question I want you to actually feel the weight of, rather than just intellectually acknowledge. Is the drive to find external confirmation for internal decisions a superstition we should be trying to outgrow? Or is it a load-bearing part of how human decision-making actually manages to function at all, under uncertainty too large for any single mind to resolve alone? I don't know. I'm not sure anyone does. Keep that one open. Here's a strange little pocket of neuroscience worth dropping into, briefly, before it gets heavy. There's a condition, well documented, where patients experience something clinicians call apophenia, at a pathological intensity, an overwhelming, uncontrollable, exhausting sense that everything, every gesture of a stranger, every scrap of overheard conversation, every advertisement, is directed specifically at them, coded with hidden personal significance. It's classically associated with certain psychotic states. And what's chilling about it, if you look closely, is that the actual cognitive mechanism at work is not different in kind from the mechanism that lets you feel moved by a song that gets you, or feel that a particular sunset means something on the day you needed it to. The pathological version isn't a different machine, it's the same machine with the volume knob broken, stuck permanently on high, unable to switch the pattern detector off even when the social context demands it. Which means the line between a spiritually meaningful coincidence and a symptom is not a line between two different processes. It's a line drawn on a continuum, and none of us know exactly where we personally sit on it, or how close we've come to the edge on our best and most meaningful days. I want to be careful here, and I want you to hold this gently rather than anxiously. This isn't a warning, it's an invitation to humility. Because here's the reframe that follows right on its heels. If meaning-making is a spectrum and not a binary, then the search for meaning in your own life, in a relationship, in a career, in a loss you're still carrying isn't something to be embarrassed about just because you can't fully verify it from outside. Verification was never really available to any of us. Even the most rigorous scientist, running the most carefully controlled experiment, is still a pattern-detecting animal choosing which patterns to test in the first place, guided by intuitions that arrived from the same unverifiable machinery as everyone else's. The lab coat doesn't disable the ancient engine, it just adds a checking procedure on top of it, which is genuinely valuable. I'm not knocking the scientific method. It's the best error correction device our species has ever built, but it's built on top of the same hallucinating organ as the mystic, the dreamer, the diviner, the conspiracy theorist, and the person falling in love for the first time and swearing it was written in the stars. Let's ground again, because I keep promising, and I want to keep the promise. Think of the specific feeling of déjà vu, that queasy, electric sense that this exact moment has already happened. Most current models treat it as a kind of memory system hiccup, a brief misfire where the brain's familiarity signal fires without an actual matching memory attached to it. So you get the feeling of having lived this moment with no corresponding content to justify the feeling. Notice what that means. It means your brain has a switch that says, this is meaningful, this is significant, pay attention. This connects to something, and that switch can be triggered completely independently of there being anything to connect to. The switch and the connection are separable, always, every time. Which means every experience you've ever had of profound meaning, the synchronicity, the sign, the moment that felt like the universe was speaking directly to you could, in principle, be the switch firing on its own, with nothing behind it. And also, every time you've dismissed a real signal as coincidence, brushed off pattern as noise out of hard-won skepticism, You could have been silencing the one time the switch was actually, truly, connected to something real. There is no clean way, from inside a single human nervous system, to fully tell these apart in the moment they're happening. You only ever get to sort it out afterward, if at all, and sometimes not even then. This is the part where the whole inquiry could tip over into despair if pattern and illusion are indistinguishable from the inside. Why trust any of it? And I want to resist that tipping, not by resolving the tension, but by turning it sideways. Because there's another way to hold this. Mycelial networks, the underground threading of fungal filaments that connects the root systems of trees across a forest floor, don't know anything about the forest above them in any way we'd recognize as knowledge. And yet they distribute nutrients, send chemical signals of drought or attack, coordinate a kind of collective forest-wide response that no individual tree and no individual fungal thread is remotely aware of participating in. Meaning, in that system, isn't located anywhere. It's not in the root, not in the filament, not in any single chemical signal. It emerges only at the scale of the whole network, only in the aggregate behavior, invisible to every single node that's actually producing it. What if your own meaning-making, the individual pattern hunger running behind your eyes right now, is a single filament in something larger you have no direct access to, not because it's supernatural, but simply because you're the wrong scale to perceive the pattern you're part of? The same way a single neuron has no idea it's part of a thought? I'm not asking you to believe that. I'm asking you to notice that you can't actually rule it out, and that the impossibility of ruling it out isn't a comfortable place to stand, and it isn't supposed to be. Let's come back to something almost embarrassingly ordinary, the feeling of recognizing a face in a crowd, a split second before you consciously realize whether it's actually someone you know. There's a strange asymmetry there. The recognition feeling and the confirmation of accuracy arrive on two different timelines. The feeling first, always first, sometimes wrong, sometimes right, and you live for a fraction of a second in a state of pure meaning without content, a signal that says known, 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 before your slower, deliberate cognition has caught up enough to check. Multiply that fraction of a second across your entire life, across every judgment you've ever made about a person's character in the first instant of meeting them, across every gut feeling you've acted on, and you start to see the actual proportion of your life that's been governed by the fast hallucinating layer rather than the slow checking layer. It's not small. For most people, across most decisions, it's the majority. Here's an open loop I'm going to leave dangling rather than tie off, because tying it off would be a lie. If the fast layer is running the show most of the time, and the fast layer cannot, by its own internal experience, distinguish a true pattern from a false one, then what exactly is the slow layer, the deliberate, verifying, scientific layer actually for? Is it a corrective, gradually dragging the fast layer's guesses closer to reality over a lifetime? Or is it mostly decoration, a story-generating module that exists to make the fast layer's decisions feel justified after the fact, so that you can walk around feeling like an author of your life instead of a passenger inside a very old, very fast, very confident guessing machine? There's a linguistic idea worth pulling in here, gently, without turning it into a lecture, the notion that certain concepts don't really exist until a language builds the box for them to sit in. Color perception is the clean example. Cultures whose languages carve the visible spectrum into fewer named categories show measurable differences in how quickly people can distinguish between colors that fall inside a single named category versus colors that straddle the line between two named ones. The world isn't pre-divided into blue and green. Something in language does the dividing, and once divided, the division starts to feel like it was always there, obvious, natural, given by the world itself rather than imposed on it. Which brings us back around again to the oldest thread in this whole inquiry. How much of what feels like bedrock reality to you right now is actually a box your language handed you so long ago, so early, so thoroughly, that you've forgotten it was ever built rather than found? I want to sit inside that question for a second rather than rushing past it, because it has a personal edge that's easy to dodge. Think of an emotion you don't have a clean word for, that specific flavor of sadness that only shows up at the end of a long trip home, mixed with relief and a strange grief for a version of yourself that existed only during the trip and won't exist again. Some languages have a compact word for something close to that. Yours might not. And notice, if you sit with it, that not having the word doesn't mean you don't have the feeling. It means the feeling arrives to you as raw, unsorted, harder to hold on to, harder to share, more likely to be misfiled under a nearby emotion that does have a name, simply because the nearby emotion has a box built for it, and this one doesn't. Which means the emotional landscape you think you know so well, the terrain of your own inner life, has been quietly reshaped your whole life by an accident of which words your particular language happened to build boxes for. You are, in some real sense, feeling the feelings your vocabulary allows you to notice, and the rest is passing through you constantly, unlabeled, unrecognized, sometimes even unfelt in any way you could report. Let's ground this in something almost absurdly physical. Try, right now, to actually notice the feeling of your tongue resting in your mouth. Most people, until this sentence, weren't aware of it at all, even though the sensory information was there the whole time, arriving continuously, simply not being rendered into conscious meaning because nothing had called for it to be rendered. Attention isn't a spotlight revealing a pre-existing world. It's closer to a printing press, producing the specific reality you're aware of, on demand, out of a much vaster substrate of ignored information running underneath, all the time, everywhere, in every one of your senses at once. Which means the world you experience as complete, as the world, as reality itself, is actually a tiny, cherry-picked printout of a much larger and permanently invisible manuscript. And the printout changes completely depending on what you happen to be looking for. This is where the mythological material gets useful, not as belief, but as diagnostic instrument, a kind of stress test for the mind that produced it. Trickster figures show up, independently, in astonishingly unconnected cultures across the entire globe. The coyote, the raven, the spider, the fox, the crossroads figure who lies, who shapeshifts, who breaks rules precisely at the boundary between order and chaos, and who is never fully good or fully evil, but who is always, specifically, the figure that makes meaning unstable right when it was starting to feel settled. Why would completely unconnected cultures, with no contact, independently produce the same narrative shape? One possibility, and I want to be honest that it's only one possibility among several, is that the trickster isn't a character at all. The trickster is a description, in story form, of the very process we've been circling this whole time, the part of the mind that destabilizes settled meaning on purpose, that refuses closure, that keeps the system from calcifying into dead certainty. Because a mind that's finished making meaning, a mind that's fully settled, stops being able to notice new patterns at all. The trickster is what it looks like, mythologized, when a species that survives by pattern recognition builds in a permanent, self-inflicted glitch to keep the pattern recognizer from ever fully trusting its own output. If that's true, and I'm not asking you to accept it, I'm asking you to feel the shape of the possibility, then the discomfort you might be feeling right now, this low hum of things not resolving, threads left open, certainties gently undermined one after another, isn't a flaw in this conversation. It's the actual mechanism doing its actual job. The unresolved feeling is the trickster working. And if you're waiting, even a little, for me to eventually tell you what it all means, notice that the waiting itself is the oldest instinct in the room, the same instinct that stared into static and found a face, the same instinct that read the future in cracked bone, the same instinct that hears meaning in noise faster than truth in silence. Here's a grounding image before we go further out again, because we're due. Think of jazz improvisation. A genuinely skilled improviser isn't generating pure randomness, and they're not executing a memorized script either. They're doing something in between, holding a loose structure lightly enough that surprise can still enter, tight enough that the surprise still means something to the listener. Meaning, in that context, isn't located in the notes. It's located in the tension between what was expected and what actually arrived. Silence again. Then, please, notice. Expectation is doing at least half the work of meaning, which means meaning might not be a property of things at all. It might be a property of the gap, the measurable, felt distance between what the pattern-hungry brain predicted and what actually showed up. No gap, no meaning. Perfect predictability is indistinguishable, experientially, from boredom, from numbness, from the flattest kind of dead certainty. And total unpredictability, pure noise, with no structure whatsoever, is indistinguishable from panic, from static, from the face that never quite resolves. Meaning, then, might live only in the narrow, unstable, constantly shifting band between those two extremes, which would mean meaning was never a fixed possession you either have or don't have. It's a moving target, permanently, by its very nature, one you can only ever be circling, never landing on. And if meaning is a moving target rather than a destination, then maybe the entire structure of this conversation, the disorientation, the grounding, the recurring returns to the body and back out into abstraction, the threads opened and deliberately never closed, isn't just a way of talking about the subject. Maybe it's the only honest way to talk about it at all, because any version of this conversation that ended in a tidy resolution would have already betrayed its own subject matter the moment it claimed to be finished. So I'm not going to finish it. I want to leave you exactly where the trickster would leave you, which is here, mid-thought, with the static still on, with a face still almost, but not quite. Resolving out of the noise in front of you, the question of why your brain insists on finding meaning in chaos hasn't been answered. It's only been relocated, deeper in, closer to the place where the asking and the answering turn out to be made of the same material. And if you sit with that for a while, really sit with it, past the point of comfort, something in you might start to notice a shape moving at the edge of your attention, and I'd let it stay unresolved if I were you, because the moment it resolves is the moment it stops being interesting, and the moment it stops being interesting is the moment you stop looking. So don't look away yet. The pattern is still forming. It hasn't decided what it is, and neither, really, have you.